Eleanor Marsh stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 6:45 in the morning and made herself a promise. She would not cry today. Not in the car, not in the elevator, not in the leather chair across from James Calloway's polished mahogany desk, and certainly not in front of Gareth, Diane, and Fletcher, who would be watching her the way wolves watch something they've already decided is wounded. She had survived 40 years in this family by understanding one fundamental truth about powerful people: they feed on visible weakness. The moment you let them see the tremor in your hands or the shine of tears behind your eyes, they lean in. They take more. They always take more. So Eleanor Marsh stood straight, smoothed the front of her black dress, and looked at the woman in the mirror with something approaching steady calm. 68 years old. White hair she had stopped apologizing for a decade ago. Hands that had managed a household, organized 1,000 dinner parties, planted 300 feet of rose garden, and never once been called remarkable for any of it. A face that had learned over 4 decades to reveal only what she chose to reveal. 40 years as the wife of one of Boston's most formidable attorneys had taught her that. She picked up Walter's photograph from the bathroom counter. Not the formal portrait from his office wall, the one his children preferred, the one where he looked exactly like the legend he'd built himself into. This was a smaller photograph. Candid. Walter at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in what must have been 2009 or 2010, reading the newspaper, coffee cooling beside his elbow, a rare unguarded softness in his expression that almost nobody outside these walls had ever seen. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it face down, picked up her car keys, and walked out. She had known Walter Marsh for 42 years and been married to him for 40 of them. She had met him in the spring of 1984 when she was 28 years old and working as a senior secretary at Morrison, Calloway and Marsh, the firm Walter had spent 20 years building into something that commanded genuine fear and genuine respect in equal measure throughout New England. Eleanor had been efficient in a way that was almost invisible, which in a law firm full of enormous egos and constant drama was considered among the highest possible virtues. She anticipated needs before they were expressed. She remembered every name, every preference, every allergy of every client who walked through those doors. She managed chaos without appearing to notice it was chaos at all. Walter noticed. He had been 45 that year, recently divorced from his first wife, Patricia, a woman whose absence from his daily life seemed to cost him nothing whatsoever beyond a substantial settlement. He had 3 children from that marriage. Gareth was 20, already carrying the particular brand of entitled impatience that comes from growing up watching your father command rooms. Diane was 18, sharp-eyed and calculating in ways that occasionally unsettled even Walter. Fletcher was 16, quieter than his siblings, still trying to understand which version of himself his family expected him to be. Walter had asked Eleanor to dinner 6 months after she joined the firm, and she had said yes with the careful composure she brought to everything, not allowing herself to think too hard about what it meant to accept an invitation from the man whose signature was on her paycheck. He had proposed 9 months after that in the garden of his Greenwich, Connecticut estate on a Tuesday evening in October, when the light was doing something extraordinary through the old oak trees, and Eleanor had been thinking about nothing more complicated than whether she'd remembered to confirm Thursday's client lunch. She said yes. She meant it completely. The wedding was in April of 1985, small and tasteful, held at the estate itself. Gareth stood through the entire ceremony with his arms crossed in an expression that communicated without requiring a single word that he considered this proceeding a personal affront. Diane was a bridesmaid at Walter's insistence, and she performed the role with such flawless surface grace and such frigid underlying hostility that Eleanor found herself almost admiring the technical achievement of it. Fletcher was simply absent in the way teenage boys can be physically present and emotionally elsewhere simultaneously. Diane had found Eleanor alone in the bride's room 20 minutes before the ceremony. "I want you to understand something." Diane had said, her voice carrying the particular pleasantness of someone who has decided that hostility is more effective when it wears a smile. "We are not going to be a family. You are not going to be our mother. Don't try to make us love you, and don't expect us to pretend. It'll be easier for everyone if we're simply honest about what this is." Eleanor had looked at the young woman in the doorway and thought several things simultaneously. She thought that Diane was frightened beneath the coldness. She thought that the children had loved their father in the uncomplicated way children love a parent who is never quite fully present, and that this wedding represented the final confirmation of something they had already suspected, that Walter Marsh's primary loyalty was always going to be to Walter Marsh. She also thought that she was 29 years old, that she loved this man with a completeness that still surprised her, and that she was not going to let an 18-year-old with a gift for cruelty determine the shape of her marriage before it had even begun. "I hear you," Eleanor had said simply. And then she had walked down the aisle and married their father anyway. For 40 years she had tried. The trying was not something she wore on her sleeve or used as currency in arguments. She simply did it consistently and without fanfare because that was who she was. She remembered every birthday, every graduation, every anniversary of milestones she had not been present for, but had taken the trouble to learn. She hosted Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter at the Greenwich estate with a precision and warmth that Walter's clients found remarkable and his children found irrelevant. She cooked, she managed, she organized and planned and smoothed over and anticipated. She entertained Walter's colleagues and maintained the specific kind of gracious, unremarkable presence that powerful men's wives were expected to maintain, visible enough to serve the social function, invisible enough not to complicate anything. She was good at it. She was extraordinarily good at it, and not one person in 40 years had ever seemed to consider that being good at invisibility is its own particular kind of loss. Walter had been kind to her in his fashion. He provided without question. He never raised his voice or his hand. He complimented her management of the household, her skill as a hostess, her patience with his children. On certain evenings, usually winter evenings, when the fire was going and the house was quiet, he would reach across and take her hand and hold it with a warmth that felt entirely genuine. And Eleanor would think that this was the man she'd married and wonder why he lived so far inside himself the rest of the time. He kept a home office that was strictly off limits. He maintained bank accounts Eleanor never saw statements for. When she had asked about their finances early in the marriage in that careful way, she asked things she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. Walter had smiled and told her not to worry, that money was his department, that her department was making the house a home and that she did it perfectly. She had accepted this. She had accepted most things because the alternative was conflict, and conflict with Walter was a cold, distant thing that lasted for days and resolved nothing. Once a month, sometimes more frequently, Walter drove north on a Friday afternoon and returned on a Sunday evening, explaining these absences as necessary decompression, a property inherited from a relative, a place where he could simply think without the weight of everything Boston represented. Eleanor packed his bag those weekends. She kissed him goodbye. She trusted him. She had spent 40 years trusting him. Walter Marsh died on a Thursday morning in March, 3 months before what would have been his 85th birthday. Eleanor found him when she brought his coffee at 7, the same ritual they had maintained for 4 decades, her coming to the bedroom door with the same blue ceramic mug, his being awake and waiting for it. He was not awake. The doctor came and confirmed what she already knew. His heart had simply stopped during the night, clean and sudden, no suffering. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the bedroom, holding the coffee mug while the steam rose and then didn't, and she tried to locate the thing she was supposed to feel. Grief was there. Loss was there. Beneath both of those was something else, something she identified only much later, a particular quality of silence. Like a question she had been carrying for a very long time had finally been answered, though she didn't yet know what the answer was. The funeral was exactly what a Boston legal legend's funeral is supposed to be. The church held 400 people and felt crowded. Judges attended. Former governors sent representatives. Colleagues who had known Walter for 30 and 40 years stood at the podium and described a man of towering intellect, fierce professional integrity, and quiet personal generosity. Not one of them mentioned Eleanor. Not one of them said, and through 5 decades of building this reputation, this man had a wife who made it possible. A woman who ran his household and raised his social world and held the structure together so he never had to think about anything except the work. Not one person said her name from that podium, and Eleanor sat in the second row where Gareth had placed her, because the front row was for family, and she understood that this too was a statement. Gareth and Diane and Fletcher sat in the front row with their spouses and their children, presenting the image of a unified family in grief. They wept with varying degrees of convincingness. Diane's eyes were completely dry behind the tissue she pressed to them. Gareth stared straight ahead with the expression of a man calculating. Fletcher looked genuinely sad, which Eleanor appreciated, even if it didn't change anything. At the reception afterward held at Gareth's house in Westport, Eleanor stood near the window with a glass of water and listened to people describe the man she had lived beside for 40 years as though they were telling her about a stranger. She heard his name spoken with reverence and admiration and the particular kind of affection people extend toward the powerful dead, and she nodded and thanked people for coming and did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had no idea really who any of these people were to him or what he had told them about her, or whether he had told them anything at all. The reading of the will was scheduled for 7 days after the funeral. James Calloway's office was on the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Boston that looked like money and smelled like leather, and the particular anxiety of people who had a great deal to gain or lose. Eleanor arrived 5 minutes early, which she always did, and found Calloway waiting with the specific expression of a man who has difficult news to deliver and has been rehearsing how to do it humanely. Gareth, Diane, and Fletcher arrived together, which Eleanor noticed. They had coordinated. They were wearing the expensive casual of people who have dressed down to signal that they are not nervous when in fact they are entirely focused. They greeted Eleanor with the polished brevity of people who have agreed in advance to be civil without being warm. They sat across the conference table from her. 3 against 1, the positioning unconscious or perhaps not unconscious at all. Calloway began with the formal language. Testamentary capacity, proper execution, the solemn machinery of making death official. Then he moved to the specifics. Walter Marsh's estate was valued at approximately $9.4 million. Eleanor's hands were folded in her lap, and she held them very still. The primary residence in Greenwich, Connecticut, currently valued at $2.3 million, was left to Walter's children from his first marriage to be divided equally among Gareth, Diane, and Fletcher, or sold with proceeds split 3 ways as they determined appropriate. The cold started at the base of her spine. Investment accounts totaling approximately $5 million. Same distribution. Retirement accounts totaling approximately $1.1 million. Same distribution. Various other assets, vehicles, personal property memberships, all specifically enumerated, all designated to the 3 children. Eleanor sat in her chair and kept her hands still and her face still and breathed the way she had learned to breathe when the situation required more composure than seemed humanly possible. Calloway set down the document and looked at her directly, which told her something before he said anything. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had argued against something and lost. "Your specific bequest is addressed next. I want you to know that I raised objections to the language of this section when Walter brought it to me. He was insistent. I am required to read it verbatim." The room was very quiet. Calloway read. The will stated that Eleanor Ann Marsh had lived comfortably at Walter's expense for 40 years and had wanted for nothing during the course of their marriage. That she had benefited from his wealth, his home, his professional standing, and a quality of life that exceeded what her secretarial background would otherwise have provided. That this constituted in Walter's assessment more than adequate compensation for her companionship and her domestic contributions to the household over the years. Eleanor heard Diane exhale very quietly, not a sigh, something smaller and more satisfied than that. The will went on to state that Walter's primary obligation was to his children, to his bloodline, to the continuation of the Marsh family name. That Gareth, Diane, and Fletcher were his true legacy. That accordingly, the only thing left to Eleanor Ann Marsh was one property located at 14 Stone Mill Road in the town of Harwick, Vermont, along with all contents therein, with the express understanding that she would vacate the Greenwich residence within 30 days of Walter's death, as that property was needed by his rightful heirs. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard. Gareth was already straightening his jacket, moving toward the practical business of what came next. Fletcher had his phone out. Diane was looking at her fingernails with the studied indifference of someone who has been waiting a long time for something and is now allowing herself the private pleasure of its arrival. Diane spoke first. "Walter mentioned that Harwick property to us years ago." She said, her voice shaped into something that resembled sympathy, closely enough to pass in polite company. "He said it was an old place he'd inherited from some distant relative, out in the middle of nowhere. He said it wasn't worth the hassle of selling. She looked at Eleanor with her head tilted slightly. But at least you'll have a roof over your head. Calloway slid a brown envelope across the table. His hand was not entirely steady. Inside was a deed, a key, and a single sheet of paper in Walter's handwriting. The key was iron-old and visibly rusted in the specific way of things that have not been touched in a very long time. Eleanor looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she put it back in the envelope. She stood. She thanked James Calloway. She did not look at Gareth or Diane or Fletcher. She walked to the door, opened it, and closed it quietly behind her. She made it to the parking garage before she allowed herself to stop moving. She stood beside her car with her hand on the door handle and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she had learned to breathe in difficult moments. 40 years. 40 years of managing his home, raising his social world, hosting his colleagues, holding his household together with a precision and care that had been invisible precisely because it was so well done. 40 years of packing his bag for those unexplained weekend trips and trusting him, of sitting in the second row at his funeral, of being the name no one said from the podium. 40 years, and Walter Marsh had called it domestic services in a legal document. Eleanor got in the car. She did not cry. She drove home to the house that was no longer her home because she had said she would not, and she was a woman who kept her word even when no one was watching. The 30 days that followed were a study in the specific cruelty of people who have decided they have already won. Gareth arrived the morning after the will reading with 2 contractors and a real estate agent. He walked through the Greenwich estate while Eleanor was drinking coffee in the kitchen, speaking to his companions as though she were not there. They measured rooms. They discussed structural walls. They stood in the garden she had spent 20 years cultivating and talked about bringing in a landscaping crew to, quote, clean everything up before listing. Those were her roses. Every one of them selected, planted, and tended by her hands over 2 decades. The word overgrown landed somewhere in her chest with a particular weight. Diane came 3 days later with an interior designer, a woman who spoke entirely in the language of staging and market appeal and what sells in this neighborhood right now. They stood in the living room where Eleanor had hosted 4 decades of dinner parties and holiday gatherings and discussed the walls which were hung with photographs of the family Walter and the children at various ages, the grandchildren, a few photographs of Eleanor that she had placed there quietly over the years without making a statement about it. The photographs would need to come down, the designer said. Buyers want to project themselves into the space. Eleanor was sitting in the armchair 6 feet away reading. Neither woman looked at her. Fletcher came less frequently than his siblings, and when he did, he had the decency to appear at least marginally uncomfortable with the situation. Once he made eye contact with Eleanor in the hallway and nodded in a way that might have been an apology. Eleanor nodded back. That was the entirety of their communication in 30 days. The nights were when the fear found its full dimensions. Eleanor would lie in the dark of the bedroom and run the numbers with the relentless precision of someone who had once been very good at managing the details of other people's professional lives. She was 68 years old. She had not held employment since 1984. Her marriage had been, as Walter's will took care to specify her occupation, and occupations of that kind do not appear on resumes and do not translate into references. The Harwick property. She had looked up Harwick, Vermont after the first night. Population 1,100. A small town tucked into the northeastern part of the state, the kind of place you could drive through and not quite register that you'd passed it. She could find nothing about a property at 14 Stone Mill Road. No listing history, no tax records she could access. Either the property was genuinely worthless or it simply didn't exist in any form that mattered. She thought about what 68 with nothing looks like. She ran the calculation carefully and found the numbers offered no comfort. One evening, 2 weeks into the 30 days, Eleanor walked down the hall to Walter's home office. She had not entered this room in 40 years, not once because he had asked her not to, and she had respected that boundary with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. The door was not locked. She turned the handle and pushed it open. The room was empty. Not empty in the way of a room that has been cleared recently. Empty in the way of a room that has been gradually, deliberately, systematically cleared over time. The desk remained. The bookshelves remained bare. The filing cabinet stood against the wall drawers, slightly open, containing nothing. Whatever Walter had kept here, whatever records or documents or evidence of the interior life he'd maintained so carefully apart from her, He had moved it, long before he died, long before she had any reason to think about it. Eleanor stood in the empty room for a long time. Then she walked back to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at Walter's photograph on the nightstand. The Sunday morning one, the one with the unguarded softness. She had trusted him completely. For 40 years, that was either the most faithful thing she had ever done or the most naive, and she was no longer entirely certain which. On the 28th day, Eleanor was at the kitchen sink washing her coffee cup when she heard Gareth and Diane's voices carrying from the dining room. The acoustics of the house, which she understood better than anyone, carried sound in specific ways that neither of them had ever bothered to learn. Gareth said he couldn't believe their father had left her anything at all, that the Harwick property was probably worth $40,000 at best, that the whole thing was guilt money, 40 years being a long time to keep anyone around, even if they were essentially just running the household, and the old place was Walter's way of easing his conscience without actually reducing what they received. Diane said that Eleanor should be grateful they were being so civilized about the transition, that most women her age with no skills and no family ended up in subsidized housing. At least she'd be able to sell whatever was in Harwick and have something to live on for a few years. They both laughed. Eleanor stood at the sink with both hands gripping the counter's edge. She could feel her own heartbeat in her fingertips. She was aware of a heat moving through her chest that was not grief and not fear, but something older and more certain than either, something that had been building for 30 days, and perhaps for much longer than that. She did not walk into the dining room. She released the counter. She dried her hands on the dish towel, folded it neatly over the oven handle the way she had done 10,000 times, and went upstairs to finish packing. The morning of the 30th day, Eleanor rose at 5. She made herself coffee in the kitchen she had designed 20 years ago, using the copper percolator she'd found at an antique market in Woodstock, and which Walter had always ignored in favor of the machine on the counter. She drank the coffee slowly, standing at the window, looking at the garden in the gray early light. The roses were just beginning. The perennials she had planted along the stone wall were coming in. 2 decades of labor and knowledge and genuine love had gone into every square foot of that garden, and whoever bought this house would either hire someone to maintain it without understanding it or tear it out entirely and start over. She left the coffee cup in the sink. She carried her 3 suitcases and 2 boxes to the car. She took the wedding photograph from the living room mantel, the one Diane had already indicated was slated for removal. She took it because it was hers, and because Gareth's protest when he appeared in the doorway meant less to her in that moment than she would have imagined it could. She cut one stem from the rose bush nearest the back gate, not the showiest one. The oldest one, planted the first spring after the wedding, the one that had come back every year for 39 years without requiring anything from her except attention. She laid it on the passenger seat. Gareth was standing on the front steps when she came around to the driver's side. He had the expression of a man who had prepared something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "The movers will be here at noon," he said. "I'll supervise everything and drop the keys at Calloway's this afternoon." Eleanor opened her car door. "Gareth," she said, and something in her voice made him stop. She did not raise it. She did not need to. 40 years of managing rooms full of powerful people had taught her that the quietest voice in a room is often the one that carries farthest. "Do you have any idea what it takes to give someone 40 years and be told it was just a service arrangement?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. "I'm asking genuinely," she said, "not to make you feel something. I'm asking because I want to know if you've ever considered it." The silence held for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Eleanor got in the car. She put it in reverse and backed down the long driveway of the Greenwich estate without looking in the rearview mirror, because she had decided before she got in the car that she would not look back, and she was a woman who kept her word. The brown envelope sat on the passenger seat beside the rose stem. Inside it, a deed, a key, a handwritten note, and an address. 14 Stone Mill Road, Harwick, Vermont. She entered it into her GPS. 2 hours and 51 minutes. Eleanor pulled onto the road and drove north toward whatever Walter had built in the silence of 40 years of monthly disappearances, toward the truth of a marriage she was only now beginning to understand, toward a future that had no visible shape yet and might have none at all. She kept her eyes on the road. She did not look back. The GPS lost signal twice on the way to Harwick. The first time was somewhere outside of Brattleboro, where the highway narrowed and the trees began pressing closer on both sides, and the signal simply gave up the way certain things give up when they reach the edge of the world they were designed for. Eleanor pulled to the shoulder, waited, watched the screen recalculate. The second time was on a county road in Windsor County that was not quite wide enough for two cars to pass comfortably, where the canopy of October maples had turned the light into something amber and ancient, and the phone in its dashboard mount showed nothing but a spinning circle for nearly 4 minutes. She had not been to Vermont in years. She had not been anywhere alone in years, she realized. Every trip she could recall from the past 2 decades had been with Walter, or in service of something. Walter needed a client dinner in New York, a bar association conference in Chicago, a family Christmas at Gareth's house in Westport that required her to spend 3 days being carefully invisible in a house that was not hers. This was different. She was on a road she did not know, going to a place she had never seen, and there was no one to report back to. She was not sure yet whether that felt like freedom or like falling. Harwick announced itself without drama. A green highway sign, white lettering the name, and a population number that seemed too small to constitute a town by most definitions. Eleanor slowed as the county road became something that resembled a main street, though barely. She counted the buildings as she drove. A general store with a hand-painted sign, a diner with a lit window, and 2 pickup trucks outside. A post office the size of a large living room. A white church with a modest steeple that needed painting. A volunteer fire station. A library that appeared to have been built in the early part of the last century and had been maintained with the specific devotion that small towns bring to institutions they understand are fragile. She drove slowly, as one does in towns like this, and she noticed people stopping to watch her car pass. Not the hostile attention of a place where strangers are unwelcome. Something else. She passed the general store, and the man sweeping the sidewalk outside paused his work and raised one hand in a small, deliberate wave, as though he recognized her car or had been expecting a car that looked like this one. A woman arranging a window display in what appeared to be some kind of gift shop turned and watched Eleanor drive past with an expression that seemed inexplicably like confirmation of something. Eleanor filed this away without allowing herself to think about it too directly. Her GPS, having recovered its signal, directed her left off the main street onto a road called Stone Mill that began as ordinary asphalt and then within a quarter-mile became packed of dirt. The trees on either side were enormous. Old-growth oak, she thought, the kind that takes 200 years to reach that circumference. There were branches so wide overhead that they formed a tunnel of shade through which the afternoon light arrived in broken, shifting patterns across her windshield. She drove slowly, the suspension of her car registering every rut and ridge. The road curved twice and then straightened, and her GPS announced in its matter-of-fact way that she had arrived at her destination. Eleanor brought the car to a stop and sat with the engine running. She looked up. The house sat in a clearing, perhaps 2 acres in size, ringed on all sides by those massive oaks, as though they had arranged themselves there on purpose. It was built from fieldstone gray and pale brown, the kind of construction that predates the Civil War and survives everything afterward through sheer density of intention. 2 stories, a steep slate roof that showed no visible deterioration. White painted trim around windows that were leaded glass, small panes in the old style, and a front door of heavy oak beneath a covered entryway with carved wooden supports that someone had designed with genuine care. Ivy grew up the left side of the house in a way that looked intentional, considered more like a design element than evidence of neglect. The grounds immediately around the house were overgrown, but the bones of something formal were visible beneath the wildness. Stone pathways, the edges still defined despite the grass growing through the gaps. Garden beds where roses bloomed without discipline but with genuine abundance. A kitchen garden area gone to herbs and wildflowers. And near the center of what had obviously once been a formal garden, a stone fountain, dry and silent, but still standing with the quiet dignity of something built to last. This was not a dump. This was not a property worth $40,000 if you were lucky. This was something else entirely. Eleanor was still sitting in the car, still processing the gap between what Diane had described and what was in front of her when she heard footsteps on the dirt road behind her. She checked the mirror. A woman was approaching from the direction of town, moving with the purposeful stride of someone on an errand they have been anticipating. She was in her mid-70s, Eleanor guessed, wearing a plain cotton dress and carrying a wicker basket covered with a check cloth. Eleanor got out of the car. "You're Eleanor Marsh," the woman said, and it was not a question. "Yes," Eleanor said. "How did you know?" "Walter told us you'd come after he passed," the woman said, setting the basket down briefly to offer her hand. "Ruth Beckett. I run the general store on Main. Walter said to watch for a woman in her late 60s driving an older Honda and to bring her something to eat when she arrived because she'd have been too distracted to stop for lunch." Eleanor looked at the basket, then she looked at Ruth Beckett. "Walter told you," she said. "He did." Ruth picked up the basket. "He told a number of us over the years. Come on, I'll help you get the door open. That key looks intimidating, but it turns smoothly." Walter oiled the mechanism every time he came. They walked up the stone path toward the front door, Eleanor, with the brown envelope in her hand, Ruth with her basket. At the door, Eleanor took out the iron key which looked in the afternoon light like something from a period drama rusted and medieval. But when she fitted it to the lock and turned it, the mechanism moved without resistance, smooth and well-maintained beneath the aged exterior. The door swung open. "Welcome home," Ruth said quietly and stood aside. Eleanor stepped across the threshold. The main room was large and ran most of the width of the house. Wide plank floors, the wood darkened to a deep amber by decades of use and care, caught the light coming through the leaded glass windows and held it. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its mantel a single piece of oak, hand-carved with a simple repeating pattern of leaves and acorns. The furniture was not new, but it was substantial and well-chosen. A leather sofa worn soft with age, two armchairs positioned to take advantage of the light from the east-facing windows, a reading table with a lamp, built-in shelves along one full wall filled with books whose spines showed genuine use. Hand-woven rugs in muted greens and browns lay across the floor in the places where they made the most sense. The room was warm, or felt warm, even without a fire, in the way that rooms feel warm when they have been lived in and cared for over a long period of time by someone who paid attention. And then Eleanor saw the photographs. They covered every wall. Not in the careless way of someone who frames things and hangs them without thinking, but with the deliberate arrangement of someone who has spent real time considering placement, light, proportion. Dozens of frames, perhaps more than dozens. Every photograph was of Eleanor. Eleanor at her wedding, 29 years old, her expression caught in the moment before the ceremony began, when she didn't know anyone was looking, and her face showed something unguarded and genuine and terrified and hopeful simultaneously. Eleanor in the garden of the Greenwich estate, kneeling in the soil with her hands in the dirt and an expression of pure concentration. Eleanor reading in the armchair by the library window, afternoon light coming through at the angle it only reached in October, the book open in her hands, entirely unaware of being observed. Eleanor at the kitchen table over coffee, early morning, looking at something outside the window, with an expression of private thought that she would not have believed she possessed. Eleanor sleeping on what was clearly the porch of this house, a light blanket over her legs, the trees visible behind her. That last one stopped her completely. She had never been to this house. She had never been to Harwick. And yet here was a photograph of her sleeping on its porch, and the trees behind her were the same trees she could see through the front windows right now. She understood in that moment that she did not yet have enough information to understand anything. She stood in the center of that room with its walls full of her own face at every age and in every unguarded moment over 40 years, and she felt something inside her simply stop holding. She had not cried at the funeral. She had not cried at the will reading. She had not cried during 30 days of being treated as a piece of furniture in her own home. She had not cried on the drive up. She stood in this room and something that had been clenched very tight for a very long time released its grip without asking her permission. And Eleanor Marsh, who had not cried in front of another person in years, stood in the middle of a room full of her own photographs and wept. Ruth Beckett said nothing. She set her basket on the reading table and stood quietly near the door, present without intruding, which is a skill that requires more genuine regard for another person than most people manage. After several minutes, Eleanor straightened. She found a handkerchief in her coat pocket. She pressed it to her face and breathed until her breathing steadied. "He came here every month," she said. Not a question. "Every month for as long as I can remember," Ruth said. "I've lived in Harwick my whole life. Walter was already coming here when I took over the store from my parents in 1991. He'd stop in on a Friday afternoon, pick up supplies. We'd talk. He came every month without exception, except once in 2017 when he had a health issue. He called to let me know he wouldn't be coming, which was the kind of thing Walter did. What did he do here? Maintain the house. Worked in the garden some, or tried to. Sat on that porch. Ruth nodded toward the back of the house. Read. He'd walk the property in the mornings, the full 247 acres. He knew every inch of it. She paused. He talked about you. Eleanor looked at her. Every time, Ruth said, he'd ask whether I thought the house was comfortable enough, whether there was something that should be improved or repaired before you arrived. He'd show me photographs on his phone, the ones he took when you weren't looking, and he'd tell me things about you. What you were reading, something you'd said that struck him, something you'd done in the garden. Ruth's expression was careful and kind. He said you were the only honest thing in his life, that everything else, the career and the money and the reputation, those were performances, that you were the one real thing. Eleanor looked at the photograph of herself sleeping on the porch. She thought about 40 years of monthly absences. She thought about the empty filing cabinet in the Greenwich office. She thought about 40 years of trusting a man who had it seemed been building something in secret with the same quiet precision he brought to everything he did. I need to read his letter, she said. Ruth pointed to a door beneath the staircase that Eleanor had not noticed. His study's in there. He left something on the desk for you. I'll put the food away and give you time. The study was small, windowless, and lined floor to ceiling with shelves and filing cabinets, and the organized accumulation of a man who had spent 50 years in the law and understood that documentation is a form of power. The desk was mahogany old and well-used with a green-shaded banker's lamp and a leather chair that held the shape of the person who had sat in it countless times. On the center of the desk, positioned with obvious intent, was an envelope. Cream-colored expensive stock sealed with dark red wax. The front read in Walter's precise and familiar handwriting, "My beloved Eleanor." She sat in his chair. She broke the seal. 5 pages written by hand, the ink slightly uneven in places, in the way of someone who has written something important and stopped and started and written again. He began by telling her he was sorry. Not the reflexive apology of someone covering their position, but the specific detailed accounting of a man who had spent considerable time identifying exactly what he had done and had not done, and why the gap between those two things had cost her something real. He was sorry he had not stood beside her publicly when his children were unkind. He was sorry he had allowed the architecture of his professional life to crowd out the simpler truth of who she was to him. He was sorry he had been, in his own word, cowardly. Then he explained. He had inherited 14 Stone Mill Road in June of 1984, 3 months after their wedding, from his uncle Thomas Marsh, a bachelor historian who had lived simply and accumulated quietly, and left a single instruction in his own will: protect this place for someone you love more than anything you've built. Walter had understood immediately that the property was valuable, not just in the monetary sense, though it was that too, but in the sense of being a place entirely separate from everything that came with being Walter Marsh of Boston. He had begun coming monthly. He had begun maintaining it, improving it carefully, gradually, the way you improve something you intend to last. He had put the deed in Eleanor's name in December of 1984, 6 months after inheriting it, not as a marital asset, as a gift structured by attorneys who were not James Calloway, in a jurisdiction separate from their primary residence, with documentation establishing it clearly as a personal gift made before the accumulation of marital wealth, and therefore not subject to marital property claims. He explained why he had never told her. Gareth had been 20 when they married. Even at 20, Walter wrote, his eldest son had understood money with a precision that came from watching his father build wealth and deciding that the accumulation of it was the primary measure of things that mattered. If Gareth had known about this property, he would have spent the subsequent 40 years finding a legal mechanism to claim it. He would have found one. Walter knew this because he had spent 5 decades watching attorneys find mechanisms for things that should not have been findable. So he hid it. He hid it completely. He never mentioned it to Eleanor because he knew that Eleanor, who trusted people completely, who believed in the good faith of family, would have said something eventually, would have asked an innocent question at the wrong moment, would have extended an olive branch that revealed the existence of something that needed to stay hidden. He hid it, and he kept it, and he built it carefully, and he arranged everything so that his death would make the transfer final and legally unassailable before his children had any opportunity to challenge it. The language in the official, well, the part that had called her domestic help with adequate compensation, had been deliberate, calculated, written specifically to give his children exactly what they needed to believe they had won everything, so they would not look further, would not ask questions, would not discover that there was something to look for. He gave them what they wanted. He wrote it in such a way that what they wanted would cost them considerably more than they anticipated. Eleanor set the letter down and opened the filing cabinet on the left wall. The top drawer contained property documents. The deed to 14 Stone Mill Road with her name on it dated December 1984. The trust documents for the Property Maintenance Fund established at a Vermont bank in 1986, structured to cover taxes, utilities, insurance, and basic maintenance for 50 years from the date of Walter's death. Assessment records showing the property's current valuation, the house and immediate grounds at $900,000, the 247 acres of protected woodland at $3.2 million, with documentation of existing interest from 2 conservation organizations who had made formal inquiries about purchase. She closed that drawer and opened the second. This one contains something different. 40 years of careful documentation organized chronologically and by subject, covering the private affairs of prominent Boston families' business dealings conducted in the assumption of confidentiality, personal arrangements between powerful people who had not considered that the attorney facilitating their arrangements might be keeping records. Walter had never used any of it. He said so in the letter. He had kept it because, as he put it, information carefully held is the quietest form of insurance there is. She closed the second drawer and opened the third. A single folder, thick, labeled with 3 names: Gareth Marsh, Diane Marsh Cole, Fletcher Marsh. Eleanor sat back in Walter's chair and read. The trusts Walter had established for his children through the official will were not what they appeared to be. They were structures of considerable sophistication, and their sophistication was entirely adversarial. Garrett's portion of the investment accounts, approximately $2.8 million, was locked in a release structure, allowing withdrawals of $100,000 per year contingent on verified continuous employment confirmed by tax records and contingent on passing an annual character evaluation conducted by an independent trustee. The trustee Walter had named was a retired federal judge who had spent 30 years on the bench presiding over financial fraud cases and who regarded leniency as a character flaw. Diane's trust contained similar restrictions, with an additional requirement that she demonstrate stable family relationships defined in the document with a specificity that made it clear Walter had understood exactly how his daughter lived her life. 3 divorces and estranged relationships with her own children meant she would be unlikely to satisfy this condition in any year, perhaps ever. Fletcher's portion was structured as an active management trust, meaning the assets would grow only if Fletcher personally directed the investment strategy with quarterly reporting requirements to the same retired judge. If Fletcher failed to maintain active management for any period exceeding 90 days, the entirety of his portion would dissolve automatically into a charitable fund Walter had pre-designated. The Greenwich estate, which his children had already begun mentally spending at market rate, carried a historic preservation easement Walter had filed with the town in 2022, 2 years before his death. The easement required any sale to proceed through a lengthy municipal review process, restricted interior modifications to those approved by a preservation committee, and bound any future owner to maintenance standards that were, in practical terms, extraordinarily expensive. Walter had also taken a substantial mortgage against the property 18 months before he died, a mortgage that had not been mentioned in Callaway's summary of the estate because it was a liability rather than an asset, in which Gareth, Diane, and Fletcher would discover they had now inherited along with the deed. Eleanor read all of it twice. Then she set the folder down on the desk and looked at the wall of the small study and thought about a man she had lived beside for 40 years and how thoroughly she had not known him and how thoroughly it turned out he had known her. He had spent 40 years protecting this place. He had spent 40 years building a trap for his children inside the machinery of the thing they were certain they had won. He had been patient in the way that only someone with a very long view of time and consequence can be patient, and he had executed it with the precision of someone who had spent 50 years understanding exactly how legal structures work and how they fail. He had given his children exactly what they wanted. He had given it to them in a form that would cost them considerably more than they gained. And he had given Eleanor a house full of her own photographs, 247 acres of Vermont woodland, and 40 years of documented proof that she had been, despite every public and private failure on his part, the thing he had valued most. She sat in his chair for a long time. The lamp cast its green shaded light across the desk, and the folder and the letter still lying open beside it, and outside the small study's door, she could hear Ruth moving quietly in the kitchen, putting away the contents of the basket, running water briefly, the ordinary domestic sounds of someone making themselves useful without making themselves intrusive. Eleanor thought about the will reading. She thought about Diane's voice saying 40,000 at best. She thought about 30 days of being walked past in her own kitchen as though she did not exist. She thought about the second row at the funeral and the eulogy that had not said her name. She thought about the empty filing cabinet in the Greenwich Home Office and understood now that it had not been empty because Walter had nothing to leave behind. It had been empty because he had already moved everything that mattered to the place where it was supposed to be. She thought about 40 years of monthly absences and understood them differently now, not as a sign of something withheld from her, but as evidence of something built for her slowly and deliberately and in complete silence over the entire span of their marriage. Walter Marsh had been many things: complicated, cowardly in the specific way of men who choose peace over honesty because they cannot bear conflict with the people they have never fully stopped trying to please. He had failed her in ways that were real and that she was not ready to forgive entirely, perhaps not yet, and perhaps not ever. But he had also played a 40-year game of patient, meticulous legal chess, and he had won it, and he had won it for her. Eleanor Marsh sat in Walter's chair in Walter's study, in the house he had built for her in the silence of their marriage, and for the first time since she had stood in a doorway holding a cup of cooling coffee and understood that her husband was gone, she felt something shift inside her that was not grief and not fear. It was the very earliest edge of something else. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She stood. She straightened her dress. She walked out of the study and into the main room where the last of the afternoon light was coming through the leaded glass windows in long amber strips across the old wood floor. Ruth was at the kitchen counter, slicing bread, and she looked up when Eleanor appeared. "Well," Ruth said not unkindly. "Well," Eleanor said. She looked at the photographs covering the walls. All those faces of herself at different ages, different seasons, different unguarded moments that Walter had seen and recorded and carried here and framed with care. She looked at them for a longer moment. "He should have told me," she said. "Yes," Ruth agreed. "He should have." He was afraid. Profoundly, Ruth said, of his children, of conflict, of losing the one thing in his life that was actually working. She set down the bread knife. Men who build very large things professionally are often remarkably small in the places that cost them the most. That's not an excuse, it's just a thing that seems to be true. Eleanor walked to the leather sofa and sat down. She looked at the cold fireplace. She thought about what came next, which was a thing she had been afraid to think about directly since the morning of the will reading, and which she was beginning to think might not be quite the catastrophe she had been imagining. "How much do people here know?" she asked. "Enough," Ruth said. "He told us you'd inherit this place. He told us you'd need time to understand it and time to settle in. He asked us to be patient and let you find your feet before the town descended on you." She smiled slightly. "In Harwick, that means people will wait at least 2 weeks before they start bringing you things." Eleanor almost smiled. "The property taxes," she said, thinking practically the way she had always been able to think practically, even when everything else was disordered. "Covered by the trust Walter established," Ruth said. "Utilities, insurance, maintenance, all of it, for 50 years from his death. You won't need to worry about any of those expenses." Eleanor nodded slowly. Outside, the Vermont afternoon was beginning its slow descent toward evening, the light through the oak trees going from amber to something deeper, the shadows of the forest lengthening across the clearing. A bird she didn't recognize sang once and then went quiet. The house settled around her with the comfortable authority of old stone. She had arrived at 14 Stone Mill Road with 3 suitcases, 2 boxes, a rose stem, and the accumulated exhaustion of 40 years of being carefully invisible. She had arrived expecting $40,000 of collapsed timber and failed a foundation. Instead, she had found a fortress, quietly built, meticulously maintained, legally impregnable, and waiting for her with the patience of something that has known all along that its moment will come. Eleanor looked around at the room, at the photographs, at the light coming through the old glass. She was 68 years old. She had nothing left from her previous life except what she had carried in her own hands. She thought that this might improbably be exactly enough to begin. James Calloway called on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Eleanor had arrived in Harwick. She was in the garden when her phone rang, wearing a pair of work gloves she had found hanging on a peg in the mudroom, and kneeling beside what had once been a formal rose bed, pulling grass from between the stones of a pathway that Walter had apparently laid by hand sometime in the early 90s, based on the mortar style and the way the stones had settled into the earth. She had been working for 2 hours. Her knees would remind her of this later. She did not particularly care. She pulled off one glove and answered. "Gareth has retained attorneys," Calloway said without preamble. He had always been a man who understood that burying the main point in preliminary language was a form of dishonesty. He's moving to challenge the transfer of the Harwick property. His argument is that it constitutes a marital asset subject to equal division and that Walter deliberately undervalued it in the will to circumvent his children's rightful claim to the full estate. Eleanor looked in the rose bed. The canes that had grown wild over years of inattention were still beautiful in their disorder, thorned and stubborn and alive. "How long do I have before this becomes formal?" she asked. "They filed a preliminary motion yesterday. You'll receive documentation by the end of the week. His attorneys are experienced and they are not inexpensive." A pause. "Eleanor, I want to be direct with you. I helped Walter structure the Harwick transfer in 1984. I know exactly how he documented it, and I am confident it will withstand challenge. But Gareth's team will make this expensive and unpleasant before they accept the outcome." "Let them," Eleanor said. There was a brief silence on the other end. "All right," Calloway said, and she could hear something in his voice that might have been satisfaction. "I'll begin preparing the response. Call me if anything changes on your end." She put the phone in her jacket pocket and put the glove back on and went back to pulling grass from between the stones. She worked until noon. Then she went inside, washed her hands, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder she had brought out from Walter's study the previous evening, the one with 3 names on it. She read through it again more slowly this time with the methodical attention she had once applied to managing Walter's professional calendar, which had been a document of extraordinary complexity and which she had navigated without error for years. She read through Gareth's trust conditions and Diane's and Fletcher's. She read the specifics of the Greenwich easement and the mortgage. She noted the name of the retired federal judge Walter had appointed as independent trustee, a man named Hargrove, who had presided over financial fraud cases for 3 decades, and who had, according to a profile Eleanor found online, once described his judicial philosophy as a commitment to ensuring that the people who design traps are the ones who end up inside them. She appreciated that. She also methodically reviewed the contents of the second filing cabinet, the one that contained 40 years of careful documentation about prominent Boston families and their private arrangements. She did not read it with pleasure. She read it with the focused attention of someone taking inventory of what they actually have, which is always the necessary first step before deciding what to do with it. When she was finished, she closed both folders and put them back in the study. Then she called Calloway back and told him she did not think the challenge would proceed as far as Gareth intended. Calloway asked why. "Because Gareth is going to read the full terms of his trust," Eleanor said, "and when he does, he will understand that he cannot afford to make an enemy of me." There was a longer pause this time. "Walter told me," Calloway said carefully, "that he had maintained comprehensive records of certain matters over the course of his career." "He did," Eleanor said. "Very comprehensive. And you've reviewed them." "I have." Another pause. "Then I think you're probably right about Gareth," Calloway said. The Mercedes appeared on Stone Mill Road on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks after Eleanor had arrived, coming slowly up the dirt road, in the way of people who have driven expensive cars all their adult lives and are unused to surfaces that do not accommodate them. Eleanor saw it from the upstairs window, where she had been measuring the second bedroom for a bookshelf she intended to have built. She watched it park behind her Honda. She watched the 3 doors open. Gareth got out first, straightening his jacket, looking up at the house with an expression that shifted in the space of about 4 seconds, from confident to something more complicated. He had been expecting the $40,000 ruin his sister had described. The fieldstone house in its clearing, with its intact slate roof and its carved oak doorway, and its formal gardens, visible even in their current state of restoration, was not accommodating that expectation. Diane stood beside him and said nothing, which was unusual. She turned slowly, taking in the oaks, the clearing, the size of the property, visible even from the drive, and Eleanor could see the recalculation happening behind her eyes the way you can sometimes see a machine shifting gears. Fletcher hung slightly back. He looked tired. He had looked tired at the funeral too, the specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing other people's certainties for a long time. Eleanor came downstairs and opened the door before they knocked. "Hello, Gareth," she said. "Diane, Fletcher, come in." She had set the kitchen table before she came downstairs. The battered copper percolator, which she had brought from Greenwich, was on the stove. She had found Walter's set of antique china in a cabinet near the fireplace, cream-colored with a simple blue border, the kind of thing that had been in a family for generations and accumulated a particular quiet authority from the accumulation of years. She had washed it the previous afternoon and set it out with the same care she had once brought to laying the table for Walter's most important professional dinners. The three of them followed her inside. She watched them absorb the room. The wide plank floors, the stone fireplace, the quality of the furniture, the light coming through the old glass. She watched Gareth's jaw tighten slightly, the involuntary response of a man recalibrating. She watched Diane's eyes move to the photographs covering the walls and stay there for a moment, something moving through her expression that Eleanor could not quite read. She poured coffee. She sat down across from them. She said nothing. She had learned in 40 years of watching Walter manage rooms and negotiations and difficult human situations that the person who fills silence first has already conceded something. Gareth lasted approximately 90 seconds. "We've had the property assessed," he said, "independently. The land value alone is substantial. Combined with the house we're looking at, over $4 million. Our attorneys believe this constitutes a marital asset that should have been subject to equal division under Massachusetts property law. Your father put this property in my name in December of 1984, Eleanor said, before the accumulation of any marital wealth, as a documented personal gift structured under Vermont property law with legal counsel separate from any attorney who represented your father in his professional capacity. The documentation is complete and has already been reviewed by James Calloway, who helped structure the original transfer and who will represent me in any proceeding you choose to initiate. Our attorneys believe there are grounds to challenge the structure, Diane said. Your attorneys will tell you there are grounds to challenge anything, Eleanor said. That is what attorneys are paid to say. What they should also be telling you, if they're earning their fees, is what the realistic probability of success is and what the cost of the attempt will be. She set her coffee cup down. But before we discuss legal proceedings, there are some things I think you should understand about the situation you're actually in. She stood and walked to the study. She returned with the folder. She set it on the table in front of them and sat back down. Your father spent 50 years as a practicing attorney, she said. He understood legal structures the way architects understand load-bearing walls. He understood exactly how to build things that hold and exactly how to build things that look solid but are designed to fail at a specific point. She looked at Gareth directly. He built both kinds in the last years of his life. Gareth reached for the folder. Eleanor didn't stop him. The silence that followed while the three of them read was the most complete silence she had experienced since the will reading, and the quality of it was entirely different. The will reading silence had been the silence of something ending. This was the silence of something being understood. She watched Gareth's face as he reached the section detailing his trust conditions. The annual character evaluation. The name of the appointed trustee. She watched the color shift slightly in his complexion, and she thought about what Calloway had told her about the retired Judge Hargrove, who had spent 30 years ensuring that the people who design traps are the ones who end up inside them. She watched Diane read the section about stable family relationships and set the page down with a deliberateness that communicated everything without saying anything. Fletcher read his section, looked up at Eleanor, and said nothing. His expression was not hostile. It was the expression of someone who has just understood something they probably should have understood a long time ago. Eleanor waited until all three of them had set the last page down. Your father gave you exactly what you asked him for, she said. All of it. He never said no to you. He structured everything in the will to give you precisely the inheritance you expected. He simply structured the access to it in ways that reflect his actual assessment of your characters. She paused. He was in the end an honest man. He expressed that honesty in legal documents rather than conversations, which was a failure of courage, but the honesty itself was real. This is a threat, Gareth said. No, Eleanor said. A threat would be me telling you what I'm going to do to you if you proceed. What I'm doing is explaining your situation accurately so you can make an informed decision. She looked at him steadily. The folder also contains documentation of certain business dealings that your father accumulated over the years. He never used any of it. He kept it because he believed in insurance. He left it to me because he understood that I would need to be able to protect myself. The room was very quiet. I am not a vindictive person, Eleanor said. I did not come to Harwick to wage war on anyone. I came here because a man I was married to for 40 years left me this property and asked me to come, and I came and I found what he built here, and I intend to stay. She picked up her coffee. What I am is a woman with comprehensive documentation of several decades of this family's private affairs and the full legal protection of a property transfer that your father structured with extraordinary care to be exactly what it is mine. She set the cup down. Walk away, she said. Accept the will. Live your lives with the inheritances your father designed for you and discover in time what those designs actually mean. Leave me alone in this house. We never have to see each other or speak to each other again, and that I suspect will suit all of us perfectly. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Gareth looked at Diane. Diane was looking at the table. Fletcher was looking at the window at the oaks outside at the afternoon light moving through them. We'll need to discuss this, Gareth said, his voice carrying the residue of a certainty that had drained out of the room somewhere in the preceding 10 minutes. Of course, Eleanor said and stood to indicate the meeting was over. She walked them to the door. She stood on the covered entryway and watched them make their way back to the Mercedes, their postures different from when they had arrived. Gareth walked like a man recalculating the terms of a negotiation he thought he had already won. Diane walked quickly ahead of her brothers, her arms crossed. Fletcher turned once and looked back at the house, and something in his expression was difficult to interpret, and then he got in the car. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the Mercedes move back down Stone Mill Road, the expensive car looking faintly absurd on the rutted dirt, and she stood there until the sound of the engine faded entirely into the ordinary quiet of the Vermont afternoon. Then she went back inside and washed the coffee cups. Calloway called 4 days later to inform her that Gareth's attorneys had withdrawn the preliminary motion. The challenge was dropped. The transfer of 14 Stone Mill Road to Eleanor Ann Marsh, documented and executed in December of 1984, was confirmed as final and uncontested. Walter would have appreciated the efficiency, Calloway said. Walter engineered the efficiency, Eleanor said, from 40 years away. She heard Calloway laugh briefly, and it sounded genuine. The Greenwich estate sold 9 months after Walter's death, following a sale process considerably more complicated and protracted than any of his children had anticipated. The preservation easement required municipal review that consumed 4 months. The necessary disclosures about the easement's restrictions on interior modification drove 2 prospective buyers away before contracts were signed. The mortgage Walter had taken against the property in the final months of his life reduced the net proceeds by an amount that required Gareth to have a difficult conversation with his own attorneys about what the estate had actually been worth after liabilities. Eleanor knew the broad outlines of this because Calloway kept her informed not out of malice, but because he believed she had a right to understand the full picture of what Walter had arranged. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. What she felt was something more like the particular peace that comes from watching a very long equation finally resolve. Gareth failed his first annual character evaluation in October of the same year. The retired Judge Hargrove submitted a 1-paragraph report to the trust administrator indicating that the evaluation criteria had not been met and that the annual disbursement would not be released. Calloway forwarded her a copy without editorial comment. Diane's trust conditions proved, as Walter had clearly anticipated, they would essentially unsatisfiable given the actual shape of her life. The requirement of stable family relationships was evaluated by the same independent trustee using criteria Walter had defined in the document, with a precision that suggested he had known exactly what he was doing. By the end of the first year, Diane had retained her own attorneys to challenge the trust conditions themselves, a process Calloway described as expensive and almost certainly unsuccessful. Fletcher's situation resolved more quickly and more quietly. He managed his portion of the investment trust for 6 weeks, submitted one quarterly report that Calloway described as incomplete, and then stopped. 93 days after Walter's death, the entirety of Fletcher's designated share dissolved automatically into the charitable fund Walter had pre-designated, a land conservation organization in northern New England that worked to protect old-growth woodland from development. Calloway found this particular detail, once he had time to appreciate it, genuinely elegant. Eleanor found it entirely like Walter. In Harwick, the seasons moved. October became November, and the oaks let go of the last of their leaves, and the clearing around the house opened up to a sky that was wider and more present than Eleanor had experienced in years. She discovered that the stone house held warmth remarkably well, the walls 2 feet thick in places, and that the wood stove in the kitchen, once she figured out his particular temperament, was more than adequate for the cold that came down from the north in December with genuine intention. Ruth came by most mornings, not intrusively, but with the comfortable regularity of someone who has decided to be a friend and is simply being one. She brought things: bread she baked on Tuesdays, vegetables from the last of her fall garden books she thought Eleanor might like. She also brought information about the town, delivered without gossip's edge, the simple intelligence of a woman who had lived in one place her whole life and understood its workings. Eleanor learned the town the way she had always learned things, systematically and with attention. She went to the library on a Wednesday afternoon and met the librarian, a quietly enthusiastic young woman named Priscilla, who had been running the collection on a budget that barely covered the electricity, and who had been, Eleanor discovered, the recipient of a scholarship that had sent her through the University of Vermont, funded anonymously by a source that the scholarship committee had never been able to formally identify. She went to the white church on a Sunday in November, sitting in the third row and introducing herself to the pastor afterward, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s named Reverend Aldous Whitmore, who shook her hand with both of his and told her that the new roof installed 3 years ago had been the answer to a prayer the congregation had been offering for a decade, and that the answer had arrived in the form of a check from a donor who had specifically requested no acknowledgement. She walked the property on the mornings when the weather allowed. All 247 acres of it, not all at once, but gradually in sections, learning the land the way you learn a language, through repeated contact and attention and a willingness to sit with not knowing until knowing arrives. She found a stone wall running through the eastern section of the woodland that had to be 200 years old, laid without mortar, by hands she would never know, persisting anyway. She found a creek she had not seen on any map running clear and cold through a stand of hemlocks, and she sat beside it one afternoon for an hour and listened to it and thought about almost nothing, which was a thing she had not known how to do for years. She found the cottage in January. She had known it was there in the general way of knowing something from a document, but finding it in the physical sense. Walking through the snow on the southwestern edge of the property and coming over a small rise and seeing the small structure in its stand of birches was different from knowing it abstractly. It was a one-room building solidly made with a wood stove and 2 windows and a porch that looked out toward the creek. Walter had maintained it the way he maintained everything on the property, with quiet competence and no fanfare. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and felt the idea arrive the way ideas sometimes arrive, not gradually but all at once, already fully formed, as though it had been waiting for her to be standing in exactly this spot. She had the 20 additional acres that Walter had documented in the final envelope. She had the $500,000 designated for whatever she chose to do with her next chapter. She had 247 acres of Vermont woodland, a stone house and a cottage on a hillside above a creek that nobody knew about except the people who belonged here. She had spent 40 years making a home for someone else's life. She understood with a thoroughness that came from actually having done it for 4 decades exactly what it required. She understood what it meant to create a space where people felt held. She understood the specific, undervalued skill of making a place feel safe. She stood in the doorway of the cottage and looked at the birches and thought about women like herself. Women who had organized themselves entirely around someone else's world and then found themselves at 60 or 65 or 68 outside it. Widows, women leaving long marriages, Women who had given everything to households and careers and families that had consumed them so completely that they had arrived at a certain age without the faintest idea of who they were when nobody was watching. She thought about what she had needed when she arrived in Harwick. Not just a house, not just financial security, though that mattered enormously. She had needed somewhere that was quiet enough to hear herself think. She had needed people who knew her name and meant it when they used it. She had needed time and space, and the specific permission that comes from being in a place that belongs to you. She spent the spring planning. She talked to an architect from Burlington who drove down in March and walked the property with her and listened carefully and drew sketches that evolved over 4 meetings into something that felt right. She talked to Callaway about the structure of a nonprofit, which was different from talking to Walter's attorneys in Boston, because Callaway had known Walter for 30 years and understood what this represented in a way that made the conversations feel like something other than purely transactional. She talked to Ruth, who had opinions about what the town needed, and expressed them with the directness of someone who has earned the right to speak plainly. She talked to Priscilla at the library about programming. She talked to Reverend Whitmore about community. She talked to a woman in Montpelier who ran a similar program for women transitioning out of difficult situations, not because she wanted to replicate what that woman had built, but because she wanted to understand what the actual problems were before she designed solutions. She broke ground in June. Marsh House opened the following spring on a Saturday in April, when the oaks were just beginning to come back and the garden Eleanor had spent a year restoring was showing its first organized bloom. The main house would remain Eleanor's residence in the administrative center. The cottage had been expanded carefully, preserving its character into a comfortable retreat space for two. The 20 additional acres had been developed with 3 small, well-made cabins, each with a wood stove and a porch, each place to have a view of either the creek or the birches or both. The program was not complicated because Eleanor had learned from 40 years of managing complex arrangements that the things that actually work are rarely complicated. Women 55 and older, stays of 2 weeks to 3 months, access to the library, the property, the community of Harwick, and to Eleanor herself, who was available not as a counselor, because she was not a counselor, but as a person who had navigated the specific terrain they were navigating and had thoughts about it. The wait list formed faster than she had anticipated. On a morning in May, a year and 2 months after she had first driven up Stone Mill Road in her aging Honda, with 3 suitcases and 2 boxes and a single rose stem on the passenger seat, Eleanor sat on the stone porch of the house at 14 Stone Mill Road with a cup of coffee and watched the light move through the oaks. Ruth sat in the other chair. They had developed the habit of morning coffee on the porch, the two of them, when the weather allowed it. Ruth brought the bread, Eleanor made the coffee. They sat and watched the property come alive in the morning light and spoke when there was something worth saying and did not speak when there was not, which is a quality of friendship that takes most people a lifetime to develop and that Eleanor had never had before and was not taking for granted now. From somewhere on the property, she could hear the voices of 2 women who had arrived the previous week. One was 63 and had spent 31 years in a marriage she had not known how to leave until it left her. The other was 67 and had nursed her husband through a 4-year illness and arrived in Harwick with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been indispensable for so long they have forgotten what optional feels like. They were walking the Eastern Trail this morning, the one that ran along the old stone wall, and their voices came through the trees at intervals, and Eleanor could not hear what they were saying, but the sound of 2 people in genuine conversation was a pleasant thing to have in the background. She looked at the garden. The roses she had planted in her first spring here were coming into their second bloom fuller and more confident than the first year, beginning to understand the soil they were in. The stone pathways she had cleared and re-leveled were holding. The fountain she had restored ran quietly at the center of the formal garden, and she had planted around its basin a combination of plants she had carried and as cuttings from the Greenwich estate, because some things are worth keeping even when the place they came from is gone. She thought about Walter in the way she had learned to think about him, which was not with anger and not with uncomplicated love, but with something more accurate and therefore more livable than either of those. He had been a man of genuine intelligence and specific cowardice, of deep private loyalty and public insufficiency. He had loved her, she believed, as completely as he was capable of loving anyone, and he had expressed that love in the only language he had fully mastered, which was the language of legal structures and financial planning and long-term strategy. He had given her a fortress disguised as a consolation prize. He had given her freedom disguised as abandonment. He had given her 40 years of evidence carefully documented and beautifully framed that she had been seen. He had failed her in the ways that mattered most while she was living beside him. She was not going to pretend otherwise. But he had also, in the end, told the truth, and he had told it in the only way he knew how, which was in documents that would outlast him and in a house full of photographs of a woman he had never been brave enough to properly defend. She had not forgiven him completely. She was not certain she ever would not entirely, and she had decided that this was all right, that forgiveness was not always a single event, but sometimes a long project, and that she had time. She had, it turned out, a great deal of time. Eleanor Marsh was 69 years old now, nearly 70, and she was sitting on the porch of a house that belonged to her in a town that knew her name, drinking coffee beside a friend who had chosen her company freely, listening to two women she had never met before last week walking through her property and talking to each other. And the morning light was doing the thing it did through the oaks at this hour, breaking into those amber shifting patterns that fell across the stone path and the garden and the fountain and the old wooden planks of the porch. She had spent 40 years being precisely who everyone else needed her to be. She had been efficient and invisible and reliable and gracious, and she had done it with a genuine skill and at genuine cost, and she had done it without fully understanding that she was doing it, which is perhaps the most complete form of devotion and the most complete form of loss simultaneously. She was done with that now, not bitterly, not with the hard edge of someone who has sworn off something. Simply done the way you are done with a room you have left and closed the door behind you. She had no idea still after a year what all of her next chapter would look like. She had the house and the lawn and the program and the friend beside her and the women walking in the trees and the coffee going cool in her hands. And beyond that, the shape of things was not entirely clear. What she was discovering was not the catastrophe she had spent 30 terrified nights in Greenwich imagining it would be. The shape of things being unclear meant the shape of things was not yet fixed. It meant there was still room for her to decide. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the oaks. At 68 years old, abandoned and erased, and handed a rusty key to an unknown address she had believed she was at an ending. She understood now with the particular certainty that comes not from optimism, but from evidence that she had simply been at the last difficult mile of a very long road, and that the road had opened, and that what lay ahead of her was not the diminishment she had feared. It was just her life, finally, unmistakably, irreversibly hers. She thought that was more than enough to begin with.